Onassis Foundation.
Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello.
Hello, could I please speak with Etgar Keret?
Oh, hi.
Etgar,
How you doing?
Etgar, what a pleasure to have you on the line, and thank you so much for being part of the Quarantine Tapes. I really wanted to capture your story in Israel at the moment and ask you at first, where are you?
Yes.
And
I'm in Tel Aviv.
You're in Tel Aviv, and what have you been up to in the last 3 months or 4 months? And has this quarantine affected your life in any way?
Well, I think that that as a writer, you're supposed to stay home all day and write stories. And I think that with the coronavirus, I was a little bit like a kid who got grounded for not doing his homework. So I had a lot of time home and a lot of time to write, and the reality, as difficult as it was very interesting. So I found this period very inspiring.
How so?
Well, I think that I think that the role of art is to fight the force of inertia, because when the force of inertia is there, you cannot reach authenticity. And I feel that a good story can break the force of inertia, the force that makes us go through the motions, do the same thing every day without really thinking, and kind of put it to a hold and see life as it is. And I think that the coronavirus kind of did it to the entire humanity. The fact that you had to wake up every day and ask yourself, what am I going to do today? Who am I? What interests me? What do I yearn for? What do I fear? Usually we just get up and say, oh my God, we're late, and we run, to catch a subway or a bus, and we go to work, and we return, and we visit an aunt, and we buy stuff that we were asked to buy. And suddenly we had to kind of reinvent ourselves, tell our stories. And again, it was very difficult and painful and scary, but at the same time, it was authentic.
You spoke about a little kid being punished, and so yeah, which I love as a formulation. So your punishment for your sins, have you written more during this period than usual?
Oh yes, much more. I've written quite a lot, and I still haven't published all the stuff that I've written. I think I'll have a story in some kind of a coronavirus special magazines that will be published by the New York Times in a couple of weeks, and I've already published a few of the pieces that I wrote. Some of them are nonfiction, others are fiction. But again, I don't think that all of them are kind of directly connected to the phenomena of the pandemic. Some of them just deal with little incidents. For example, I went to a supermarket and I saw two people fighting over a package of toilet paper. I never saw anything like this in my life, and they were fighting. They were not looting it. They wanted to buy it, And I thought to myself, the first thought I had in my mind was that I guess in the bottom line, you can't use a credit card to wipe your ass, So when kind of money fails, when you go to those kind of most basic products, there is something animalistic that comes out, and when you see a moment like this, you want to write about that. You don't want to write about the virus. You don't want to write about a reality as it is. You just kind of capture a glimpse of something, and I think that in times that are so extreme, in which people don't go out to the street, or in which the connection between people kind of can become very strange. It could be very suspicious. You see the same people going the streets, and some of them are ignoring the pandemic, and others are kind of super sensitive to it, and you can feel the tensions between them. So suddenly, this kind of a mundane experience of living in your neighborhood becomes very alive and real. I would go every morning to the beach and just walk on the beach, and the beach in Tel Aviv is packed almost all year long, and I would go and see nobody and feel like an outlaw, So for me, like doing this, the most normal activity of taking a walk next to my home suddenly became an adventure.
What does dissent look like within Israel at this moment?
What? Sorry, what does what?
Dissent.
I'm not. I don't know the word. Dissent.
Dissent is when you don't agree with the dominant opinion.
So here it's really interesting, because I think it would be difficult to figure out if there is a dominant opinion because there are a lot of people here. Some of them are experts in immunology and virology that claim that the corona cannot be contained, and that many more people than we think already got the pandemic, and they kind of challenge all the system of tests and all the activities and the decisions that the government takes, because they are, admittingly, very strange. The first place that got opened or reopened was IKEA, of all places. And then, I don't know, now, for example, you can have a wedding with up to 250 people as guests, but you can't go and see a movie, even if, if half of the cinema hall is empty, So everything seems kind of arbitrary. When do you let artists perform? When do you let restaurants open up? Nobody really knows, and nobody has a system.
But I don't mean only dissent around the pandemic. I mean dissent as in disagreeing with the dominant opinions.
No. So I must say that that there is nothing better than a big exterior fear to let people who are less democratic, get things their own way, and I think that that right now there is a situation where people are afraid for their health, but more than that, they're afraid, for the living and livelihood, and you really feel that in this kind of situation of a struggle for survival, then it's very easy to forget or ignore or put aside, issues like the Palestinian state, or taking one-sided action that will be an obstacle in the way of peace. It's not I don't think it's a good time for democracy or liberal thought anywhere, because the moment anxiety is being introduced, people more easily give up their liberties.
And they manipulate this, in a way, this pandemic, and in the US, it's of course, there's a pandemic on the one hand, and then there's everything else that's happening. In a sense, people can manipulate it. And so a question I would have for you is, has discourse expanded or contracted as a result of this pandemic?
So for sure, I think it contracted, and also I think it became less felt. Like it's very difficult even to have a polemic right now, and I think that this is what makes what's going on now in the US so admirable. Because when you see in times it is so difficult, the fact that that the people who go in the streets, they don't necessarily demonstrate for themselves. They demonstrate, for their friends. They demonstrate for their fellows. And I must say that that about the times that the protest started in the U.S., an autistic young Palestinian man was shot and killed. The circumstances were, of course, different from the Floyd case, but it was like totally out of line and didn't make any sense, and use of in proportion strength, etc. But here it didn't make the echo, or
right.
Didn't get the reaction that you got in the States, and I think it shows that with all the difficulties, the U.S. has a powerful, in my eyes, majority, who wants to fight for equality and wants to have a more just system.
Have there been such demonstrations in Israel?
Yes, there have been demonstrations that, on various grounds, but all of them were anti-government and anti-Netanyahu.
Right.
And I remember that, in those early demonstrations where we would go, I think one of them, his son tweeted that we're all murderers or whatever, because we go and demonstrate, even though a safe distance was kept. And I think that he said that he hopes that all the coronavirus were going to die out of kind of outrageous behavior.
Really.
So he said that he hopes that they all be left-wingers, the ones that are going to die.
Incredible. Etgar, how has a movement like Black Lives Matter or a movement like Defund the Police, how is it perceived in Israel? And is there also a generational divide?
Well, I think that it's not even a generational divide. I think that that Israel is a country in a constant polemic. So I think that people who lean more to the left, of course, identify with those causes, and people who are right wingers, identify more with maybe the Trump side. But what is amazing for me is that how many people are able to avoid reflexiveness when dealing with this point, because again, I'm not saying that the situation is identical, but you cannot ignore some of the similarities, the feeling of inequality, a minority suffering from violence or being kind of prejudiced, or suffering from prejudice. So for me, it was really kind of interesting how I would discuss with people who would totally identify, with Black Lives Matter movement, but at the same time would not want to use the same system, in the place in which they live. They would say, policemen in America are crazy. But come on, here we are fighting for our survival, and we were fighting against terrorists, etc. So there was kind of a very strong denial of any similarity between the situations.
Earlier this year, you said, "We Israelis have traded in the Jewishness of a Kafka and a Babel for the military generals we love so much. Indeed, we may even have forgotten that our most heroic biblical characters are memorable for having argued with God. Now, what does it mean, Etgar, to argue with God? And in that context, how important is humor? And how much of humor how much humorlessness might we be suffering from at this moment?
Yeah, well, for me, I think that when you brought up being Jewish and you look at all your heroes, and it could be Abraham or Jonah or Job or basically almost any of the big ones, and they all have the situation in which they disagree with God, they defy Him or they say the opposite, and I think that this is something that for me is very fundamental in Jewish thought, to always challenge ideas and things that are stated to you, to be in this kind of constant polemic, and I think that for me, losing that is kind of losing your Jewishness. I think the Jews are not famous for being submissive,
right?
And I about humor, I think that humor is essential for me every day. It's my way of dealing with anxiety. It's my way of dealing with depression. And it's my way of kind of trying to learn my thoughts and become better. It all goes through humor. I think life without the humor would be worse, at least a little less than they are with humor.
And I always think, and I think we might have spoken about this before, I always think about Max Frisch and the great Swiss writer who said that humor, Frisch spoke about that, UNESCO spoke about that, how dangerous humor is to totalitarian governments.
Well, I can say that I can easily imagine the Swiss person being intimidated by humor, but I agree with the fact that, again, the totalitarian regime is afraid of some kind of reflectiveness, of a way of kind of looking at yourself or at your system from the outside, being critical of it. And humor is I guess, the best way to do it. Even as a young child, being kind of the smartest child, I realized that, that the best way I can criticize the system and not get beaten is if I do it in a joke. If you say to somebody, hey, you're doing something wrong, and you're able to say it in a funny way that would make other people laugh, then you might get away without getting punched.
I was curious to read that you recently, after getting a big prize, you recently chose to have your work translated into a language that you don't yourself understand, but that matters greatly to you, which is Yiddish. Now, why?
Well, when I got the Sapir Prize, and then you have to choose one language that your book will be translated to, except for Arabic. And the book was translated to Arabic. And as a second language, I really wanted to pick a language that I didn't have any chance to have my book get translated to it in any other way. And I picked Yiddish. And Yiddish, there are very few new translations to Yiddish. Actually, there is a Harry Potter translation, but except from that, I think there is a huge gap, and especially, by the way, when it comes to Israeli writers. And I felt that I owe Yiddish a lot, both because many of my literary heroes, wrote in Yiddish. Bashevis Singer, Shalom Aleichem, were both Yiddish writers. And also because Yiddish was the language my parents used a lot at home, especially when they didn't want me to understand what they were saying. And they would always have this saying that they would say that in Yiddish it sounds funnier. Whenever they would translate or interpret something to Hebrew, they would say in Yiddish it sounds funnier. And the truth is that Yiddish is a very colloquial language. It's a spoken language. And there is something about storytelling in Yiddish that always feels slightly oral. And I think that this kind of tradition of storytelling affected my writing a lot. So I thought it's a good way to pay the debt back.
Pay the debt back. It's wonderful. So your parents would say that it was a secret language for them in a sense, and they said that it sounds funny. It reminds me of two great translators from Russian to English. One is American and one is Russian, and they were reading a book by Dostoevsky side by side, and she who was Russian was laughing and he who was American wasn't, and they decided on the basis of that they had to retranslate Dostoevsky because the humor was lost. But what is so interesting is that so much, and you've said it yourself about translation, so much is lost in translation. And so much is not conveyed. But here you're even going beyond that, because you're having a book translated in a language that you will probably never understand.
Yeah, but if someday I see somebody laughing while reading my Yiddish translation, then I'll finally know that everything is funnier in Yiddish.
When you were 9 years old, a book that struck you so deeply, I think, because you've written about it, is Huckleberry Finn. Why do you think it left such a strong impression? And have you reread it since then?
Yeah, I've reread it a few times, and I think for me, the story of Huckleberry Finn, who is helping an escaped slave, get his freedom. There was something for me as a child that was very sophisticated in the storytelling, because the Huckleberry Finn is the narrator, and he doesn't see the act of helping a slave escape as a heroic act. He actually sees it as a cowardly act, as kind of submitting to his weaknesses, basically helping a slave escape while the slave is another person's property. He actually believes that by helping the slave get away, he will get a place in hell, And there was something about this kind of reverse psychology, something about this strategy that, that even as a kid you read it and you say, no, you're doing the right thing, you're doing the right thing. That really evoked something very strong in me. And for me, it was the first time I've learned about racism and racial differences. It's kind of I've heard about the Shoah, but in Israel, there were no Africans at the time. It was before we had immigrants from Ethiopia. So this whole idea of the fact that there were black people, that I didn't know any black people, and those black people were mistreated by white people and seen as this. So it all seemed almost like an allegory, something that was totally irrelevant to my life, until I just the same day I finished the book, I've seen a kind of a guy who had a falafel stand, half bullying the Palestinian worker there. And looking at these dynamics of power, where one feels that he's in a weaker position just because of his ethnicity, kind of made me realize that the book I've read was relevant for my life and my country too.
Something different that I need you to help me understand. A Pew Survey from January of this year found that 71% of Israelis approve of Trump. How is that possible, Etgar?
For me, it's very simple. I think that for many people, the American president is judged by how they feel he'll be committed to Israel if a pogrom will arise. I think that there is something about our country kind of collective thought is this kind of constant fear from a genocide. And when you have somebody like Trump who basically kind of ignores the Palestinian side and all the time kind of pushes for some kind of a rhetoric of power and not a rhetoric of reconciliation or solving problems, then I guess that for many Israelis they think that they can count on him in this kind of very narrow state. It's a little bit. I think it's very kind of a diaspora kind of thought, saying there is the Tsar or whoever is up there, and okay, there are some politics or some ideas, but the big question is, will a program start or won't a program start? And actually, I feel that, as somebody who's really very much worried for the future of Israel, that, that Trump and Trumpism, it's not only bad for the U.S., it's bad for the world, bad for the Middle East, and bad for Israel.
Etgar, in closing, I would love for you to leave us with some of your writing. Choose something to read, and I'd love for our listeners to get a sense both of the urgency of your writing, the way in which maybe it foresees a lot of what will happen, and the humor and also the incredible economy of means.
Great. So I actually read my shortest story ever, so it doesn't get any shorter than that. And it's called Asthma Attack, and basically I'm asthmatic, and with the coronavirus, I must say that that it kind of brought me back to my childhood and this kind of fear of not breathing. And it also reminded me of the story that I wrote many years ago, and it goes like this. When you have an asthma attack, you can't breathe. When you can't breathe, you can hardly talk. To make a sentence, all you get is the air in your lungs, which isn't much. 3 to 6 words, if that. You learn the value of words. You rummage through the jumble in your head, choose the crucial ones, and those cost you too. Let healthy people toss out whatever comes to mind the way you throw out the garbage. When an asthmatic says, I love you, and when an asthmatic says, I love you madly, there's a difference. The difference of a word. And the word is a lot. It could be stop or inhaler. It could even be ambulance.
It's extraordinary to have read that many years ago as I did, and so extraordinary to hear it nearly in the midst, I was going to say in the context of, but it isn't really in the context of, it's in the midst of the pandemic and everything that's happening. But of course the pandemic is only part of it. It reminded me of a sentence written 50 years ago, if not more, by Frantz Fanon, who said, "We revolt simply because for many reasons we can no longer breathe."
Yes, it's essential.
Etgar.
Yes.
It's a pleasure to talk to you. It always is, and it's. I hope you stay well. You continue to be very productive. Also, once this pandemic ends, I'll be very curious to read what came out of this moment where you were even more at work than usual. I look forward to reading it.
Thank you, Paul.
It's a real pleasure to talk to you. Stay well, and I hope to see you in person soon.
Oh, me too. So thanks, Paul.
Thank you so
and goodbye.
much. Take
Good
care.
night.
Bye-bye. Good night to you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.